Hi everyone, this is Mrs. J, and I'm doing a read aloud of The Boy's War by Jim Murphy. We're on Chapter 3, What a Foolish Boy, on page 27. Union infantry marching near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Day after day and night after night did we tramp along the rough and dusty roads, writes 16-year-old Confederate soldier John Delaney, near the most broiling sun, which was the month of August ever afflicted a soldier, through rivers and their rocky valleys, over mountains, and on, scarcely stopping to gather green corn from the fields to serve as rations. During these marches, the men are sometimes unrecognizable on account of the thick covering of dust which settle upon their hair, eyebrows, and beard, filling likewise the mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. Boys on both sides soon learned a boring fact about life in the army. Soldiers spent more time marching from one place to another than fighting. At each town, new units would join the troops until the column stretched for miles with no beginning or end in sight. A messenger might fly past on horseback carrying orders for the officer in charge. The column would halt for half an hour or an hour with no explanation of what was happening ahead. Then suddenly the order would be shouted up and down the line, and the drum beat would sound, and the troops would be on their way again. Not that they understood what all that maneuvering was about. It did not take Elijah Stockwell very long to comment on this with his dry wit. We didn't know where we were going, as a soldier isn't supposed to know any more than a mule, but has to obey orders. What the common soldier didn't realize was that the commanders for both sides were engaged in a large scale chess match in which they were the pieces. The first two commanders of the Union Army, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott and then Major General George McClellan, had decided on a defensive war, at least until they could amass, outfit, and train a vast army. Both feared that if the Confederate troops were able to capture Washington, D.C., civilians and politicians in the North would become demoralized and abandon the fight. They also hoped that the South would lose energy and give up in its quest for independence. The Confederate commander, General Robert E. Lee, adopted a cautiously offensive plan. He knew the Union Army outnumbered his by almost 2 to 1 and that it had more supplies. He could never hope to win any head to head battle. Instead, he decided to use smaller, fast moving groups of soldiers and cavalry to strike the Union forces in many places, then wheel around and strike again. By poking at the enemy, he hoped to hold his losses down while buying up time to build up his forces. And he, like Scott and McClellan, hoped the other side would abandon the fight. When the boys enlisted in the army, they expected to fight the enemy and settle the dispute very quickly. After all, Lincoln's initial call for enlistments asked for only 90 days of service. But after what seemed like an endless amount of marching and a few hard fought battles, it became clear that neither side was going to surrender easily or quickly. And once they realized the war would last a long, long time, these boys began to miss things that they had left behind, namely their family and friends. Homesickness was a common problem and found expression in many forms. Singing was one of the way to express such feelings. One of the most popular war songs for both sides, called Tenting Tonight, was written even before the first year of fighting was completed. A few of its lines go, "We're tenting tonight at the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, song of home and the friends we love so dear. We've been tenting tonight on the old campground, thinking of the days gone by and the loved ones at home that give us a hand and the tear that said goodbye." Many boys simply put down what they felt in their own words. One Southerner, J.B. Lance of Buncombe County, North Carolina, was already tired of life away from home in October 1861. His message was simple and direct, yet poignant. "Father, I have saw a right smart of the world since I left home, but I have not saw any place like Buncombe and Henderson yet." It's easy to see why these boys developed such feelings. They were so young and had little real sense of who they were or how they fit into the world. The one solid and reliable thing they knew, their families, had been left behind. Their futures were uncertain, and they had not had time to develop real friendships with others in their units. John Delaney managed to capture in his journal this feeling of being apart and alone. "I felt strange enough, lying down. This is my first night in camp. The strange faces and forms, the near and distant sounds of the army and men talking, shouting, and singing, and all upon different subjects, the croaking frogs, the cries of whip poor Will, the glare of the campfires, and the neighing of horses, and the deep shadows of the dark night overhang all. All of these were not calculated to allay my uneasiness of mind or lighten my heart of its cares." Despite the endless marching and the tactics of avoidance both sides seemed to favor, the war would eventually catch up with these boys. One day they would hear the dull thudding of large cannons, known as 30-pounders, being fired from the distance. Plumes of smoke would rise from a nearby valley. As they would draw nearer to the action, the firecracker smell of small arm fires grew more and more frequent. These Union soldiers don't look very military, but their mortar, nicknamed Dictator, could hurl shells 2.5 miles with deadly accuracy. An officer would call their company to order. Rifles would be loaded and blankets and haversacks piled in a heap against a tree to wait their return. Then they would move off toward the fighting, their eyes searching the mysterious forest around them for the enemy. It was often well before they had a chance to fire a shot in anger that these boys learned about the cruel horrors of war. Elisha Stockwell's experience Elijah Stockwell's unit was 1 mile from fighting at the Battle of Shiloh when he had this experience. The first dead man we saw was a short distance from the clearing. He was leaning back against a tree as if asleep, but his intestines were all over his legs and several times their natural size. I didn't look at him the second time, as it made me deathly sick. A little farther on, we saw lots of dead men scattered through the woods where they had fallen the day before. The officer would order the men on, not allowing them to dwell on what they were seeing or feeling. Keep low, he would shout. Stay alert, boys. The enemy is near. Gunfire grows heavy not more than 100 yards to the left, and yelling can be heard, though the words are unclear. What follows are the views of 5 boys going into battle for the first time. While each one fought in a different battle, their voices and experiences form a remarkably unified picture of what fighting must have been like for an inexperienced soldier. Thomas Galway recounts what happened to his unit as he moved closer to the gunfire. Before we had gone far, we came to the hanging rock with a tree felled across a road under it. Evidently, this barricade had been put there on purpose. As we stepped over the log, we said to one another, "There is something here, and soon we shall see what it means." We were scarcely over the log when a sheet of flames burst through from the top of the cliff. The detonation was startling to our unaccustomed ears. This unidentified Confederate soldier had his legs shattered early in the battle. He wrapped a cotton shirt around the wound and continued fighting until a bullet struck him in the heart. Soldiers killed at the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Suddenly, the war that had been a romantic dream was all around them like angry bees. Elisha Stockwell found himself face down in the ground, shells exploding all around, and soldiers screaming for help. I want to say, as I lay here and the shells are flying over us, my thoughts went back to my home. And I thought what a foolish boy I was to run away and get into such a mess that I was in. I would have been glad to see my father coming after me. But the only things searching for these boys were the shot and shell of their enemy, which ripped up the clots of the earth, stripped the leaves from the trees, and too often found their mark. Soon a voice can be heard urging the soldiers to get up and move forward. It's an officer from another unit who actually grabs some soldiers by the shirt and hauls them up and pushes them into motion. Young Tyler Wise tells about these tense moments. We moved quite lively as the rebel bullets did likewise. We had advanced but a short distance when we came to a creek, the bank of which was too high, but we slid, the wading through the water on the opposite side, and began firing at will. For 2 hours the contest raged furiously. The creek was running red with precious blood spilt for our country. My bunkmate and I were kneeling side by side when a ball crashed into his brain. With assistance of 2 others, I picked him up and carried him over to the bank in our rear and laid him behind a tree. But there was no time to grieve or even feel sorry. A few minutes later, Wise re-entered the battle. Naturally, Confederate boys went through much of the same initiation. What was different was that Confederate troops seemed to do much better in the early fighting. Credit for this success has to go to the Southern officers. They did a much better job of keeping their men united and pressing forward even in the midst of heavy fire. And they tolerated such unmilitary but emotionally unifying behavior as the dreaded rebel yell. No two descriptions of the rebel yell are alike, though one soldier described it as a mingling of an Indian whoop and a wolf howl. Whatever it sounded like, it must have worked well for the soldiers. William Chambers describes his first experience with it. I always said if I ever went into charge, I wouldn't holler. But the very first time I fired my gun, I hollered as loud as I could, and I hollered every breath until we stopped. This Virginia boy, Andrew J. Hodge, was killed at Gettysburg, 1863. It would be over a year before his remains were collected and buried. Another Confederate soldier describes its use in battle. Then the rebel yell was sounded, and right into their ranks we dashed, pouring a deadly volley into their faces. At the moment more the enemy broke and fled wildly. The scouts kept up the hot pursuit, and on they ran, and the rout was complete. When either side broke the ranks in search of safety, the result was a confusion of racing soldiers through forests or across fields. Elijah Stockwell's first fight ended like this. We had lost all formation, and we were rushing down the road like a mob. When we got to the foot of the hill, there was a small stream of water from the rain of the night before. We stopped there and got behind a small tree. I could see the little puffs of smoke at the top of the hill on the other side, some 40 rods from us, and I shot those puffs. The brush was so thick that I couldn't see the Rebs, but loaded and fired at the smoke until a grape shot came through the tree and knocked me flat as I was putting my cap on my gun. I thought my arm was gone, but I rolled onto my right side and looked at my arm, and I couldn't see anything wrong with it. So I got to my feet with my gun in my hands, and I saw the Rebs coming down the hill just like we had. The road was full of several rods, and I shot for the middle of the charging crowd and began loading. But as they were getting closer, I looked behind me to see what the rest of my friends were doing. I saw the colors going out of sight over the hill, and only 2 or 3 of the men in sight. As I started to run, I heard several shout, "Halt!" But I knew it was the Rebs, and I hadn't any thought of obeying them. Such undisciplined retreats could often cover miles, with soldiers tossing aside their rifles, ammunition, and hats to lighten their loads. Civilians, who often picnicked on nearby mountains to watch the Civil War battles, might even find themselves trampled by panicking soldiers. A few soldiers would not stop running until they reached home. Gradually, the fighting would lessen and then stop. Struggling soldiers would regroup. Night would settle on the battlefield, and the eerie shadows of the soldiers could be seen moving across it, searching out the groaning and wounded and digging hasty graves for the dead. Meanwhile, in camp, exhausted soldiers huddled around the fire, ate, and tried to rest up for the next day's fighting. Some would tell tales of their bravery or of some of the strange things they had seen during the fighting. Others, like Tyler Wise, would think about a friend they lost that day. I dreamed of my bunkmate last night, Wise wrote in his diary. Wonder if his remains will be put where they can be found. For I would like, if I ever had got the chance, to put a board with his name on it at the head of his grave. A weary Union camp at Nashville settles down for the night.